Coming up in This Week in Computer Hardware, AMD Zen versus Broadwell-E, new mobile GPUs from NVIDIA Intel Developers Forum. We got Alloy VR and a BRIX. All that more coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 377, recorded August 18th, 2016. AMD Zen beats Broadwell-E.
This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Automatic, the small adapter that turns your clunker into a smarter, connected car. For more information on their brand new Automatic Pro adapter, visit automatic.com/twit and enter the limited time offer code TWIT for $20 off the new device.
Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware. Twitch's weekly show that aims to bring you the most useful, most informative, most engaging, and occasionally most delightful news in PC and mobile hardware. And boy, what a week it has been. Last week, we had Alan Malventano on to talk about Flash Memory Summit, including the possibility of 32 and 60 terabyte SSDs, one of which you won't be able to get in your home unless you're running enterprise-class servers. And that snicker you just heard from was from Mr. Ryan Shrout, and he and I were just at Intel Developer Forum, which took place in San Francisco. But before we get anywhere near that, I think we should probably start with AMD's Zen. Out of the darkness, we have one benchmark, and they're putting it up against Broadwell-E. 8 cores, 16 threads, one benchmark. Is AMD back, baby?
So a couple of caveats right there. So that it's not they didn't give us like a benchmark number. They didn't give us anything, and these aren't finalized like clock speeds and stuff. So it's really early for this. I'm a little surprised that they're showing this type of stuff early. But I think in recent weeks they've had some negative media talk about the fact that maybe the claims that AMD had for IPC improvements, which is instructions per clock, which is a very, very important metric for how well your single-threaded performance is on a processor. Right. They were making claims of 40% improvements over Bulldozer, Excavator, their previous architecture designs. And that's a astounding number, to be honest, right? If you think about what Intel has done on a generation-to-generation jump, it's usually in the 2 to 5% range. When you went from Sandy Bridge to Ivy Bridge, or Ivy Bridge to Haswell, Haswell to Broadwell, those types of things is what we're talking about, 2 to 5% improvements. So a claim of 40%, raised a lot of eyebrows and was put into question, and I think legitimately so. So they actually had an event on the last day I was there. Of course. While the media was already gathered for Intel Developer Forum, they thought this would be a good opportunity to invite people over for this. And what they showed was they talked a little bit about the architecture, but I didn't go into a whole lot of detail on this because next week is the Hot Chips conference where they're going to go into a lot more detail on the architecture itself, and we'll have a different story on that. The important part was that they wanted to showcase that Summit Ridge, which is going to be the code name for the 8-core, 16-thread version of the processor on a DDR4 AM4 platform with PCIe Gen 3 and all the I/O stuff you would expect. They wanted to show that their 40% claims of IPC improvements were there. Now, they didn't compare Zen versus Excavator or anything like that. What they did was they compared Zen to Broadwell-E. Broadwell-E is the most recent Intel Extreme, enthusiast platform product. Now, a couple things as you look at this slide, as I realize now the incorrectness of cutting off the first several letters of the word performance at the top, but oh well, so much for that. What they did was they took an 8-core 16-thread Zen and an 8-core 16-thread Broadwell-E and ran them at identical clock speeds, static clocks. So they were all running at 3 gigahertz. And it's important to note that for a couple of reasons. One, Broadwell-E runs much higher than 3 gigahertz. Broadwell-E actually has a 10-core variant as well. So this is not like the best Broadwell-E part you could get. But what AMD was trying to demonstrate is like, hey, we're working on getting our clocks where we need them to be. And they did say in Q&A afterwards that clocks would be higher than 3 gigahertz, but they didn't elaborate much more than that. But that the clock-to-clock IPC performance between Zen and Broadwell-E is very, very close. And in fact, I think the Zen finished, a little bit ahead, just barely ahead in terms of watching a benchmark complete, a render of Blender complete. So thus proving that, hey, Zen is competitive with Broadwell, and nothing
Right.
AMD has had even came close to that. And
years.
so, yeah, for
Well, so
8 years
part
or
of
something.
it's yeah, and that's like on one hand, I completely get what you're saying about AMD. They took like a Core i7 6900K, which clocks at 3200K. It's 3.2 gigahertz base. It can go to a 3.7 gigahertz boost mode, which of course you're only going to keep up if you got enough cooling coming off the top of the processor. So they kind of artificially deflated the performance of the 8-core Core i7 6900K, but it's still, for them to be even in the neighborhood of a flagship X99 processor
Yep.
is a big deal.
It really is. It's so the assumption is, what we take away from it is, okay, if Zen runs at similar clocks, 3.5
Right.
gigahertz and a little bit above or a little bit below or whatever, when this processor is available in early 2017, it will be competitive. Will Intel be able to just will they have Skylake E out by then? I actually don't think so. Will Intel still have the performance advantage if they really want to have it? I think they still could, especially when it comes to multi-threaded. They've already proved that they have 10 cores. They can go above that if they want. The key here is like AMD has a part that's going to make people excited again. Now, there's all questions of, what is the power consumption? They said it was competitive with Broadwell-E without being more specific. They would obviously they wouldn't answer questions on prices or anything like that. And if you look at what AMD as a company has done on the GPU side, they have stated that they were willing to sacrifice high ASPs, high selling points, high profit margin in order to gain market share, build excitement, gain that user base back. I'm thinking they will do the same with Zen on the enthusiast side, that they will, undercut Intel's pricing, which on Broadwell-E is not difficult to do considering the 10-core part is $1,700, and make an enthusiast platform that gets people excited again. If you could sell, a part that's competitive for competitive against the 8-core variant of Broadwell-E, which is $1,000, and you can sell it for $600, and have a platform that has all the modern things like support for M.2, PCIe, NVMe SSDs, and Thunderbolt, and USB 3.1, and all these types of technologies that AMD's platforms lack today. I think it's really exciting to see them deliver on that plus 40% IPC. And I will say one other caveat about that, don't expect AMD to do this with the next iteration of Zen. They're not going to get another 40% IPC. The reason that they could get a 40% IPC improvement in one generation is because they had fallen so far behind on their IPC. So this fundamental ground up re-architecture, doing very fundamental things like, we have 1-to-1 ratio of integer to floating point units as opposed to 2-to-1 integer to floating point, right? And, fundamentally modifying how the architecture works. Now that we know how workloads are going and how multi-threading works, they implemented a hyper-threading SMT alternative. They basically are catching up in one big step, and then we'll have to see how they iterate after that to keep up with Intel along the way. But very, very, very cool stuff to see, and I was absolutely not expecting to see that this week. So that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was certainly released to pull a little of the sail out of Intel's wins at IDM this week. IDF this week, because they barely talked about processors, and we'll get to that a little later in the show. There was kind of one processor-centric demo that Intel did, and other than that, they just mentioned Intel CPUs as being components and other agendas they pushed. I believe it was Mr. Ryan Shrout who said it seems like every year before IDF, Intel sits down and goes like, what's hot? And then builds a series of presentations and products around what's hot, including VR, drones, and smart cities and other things we'll talk about a little later in the show. The other thing that I thought was interesting that came out this week was, to me at least, Josh wrote up ARM partnering with Intel for 10 nanometer production. In part because originally I read that I was like AMD, and I was like AMD and Intel are partnering, and then I got my dyslexia in check and realized that it was ARM partnering with Intel. And I can't decide if this is a weird way of Intel, acknowledging that they are not going to compete, certainly in terms of volume, with ARM in the mobile market, and they may as well make ARM money off of ARM some way, or money off of mobile some way. This is, Josh writes that it's both surprising and expected. He said surprising in that it happened as quickly as it did, expected as Intel facing a very different world than it had planned for 10 years ago. We could argue that it's very much different than they planned for 5 years ago. I thought that was a really interesting announcement. Intel's Custom Foundry Group partnering up with ARM to deliver a 10 nanometer process to ARM devices, or to ARM processors.
I think what you'll find is, so like, keep in mind that ARM doesn't make products, right? They only make IP. So the partnership is, ARM is gonna work with the foundry guys at Intel to make sure that their architectures will work on that 10 nanometer process, so that ARM partners can come in and make their SoCs that way. Intel's gonna be smart about this in that they're not in any areas that they still compete. I think you will find that they will avoid making processors that will compete against their own products, right? So, but because of Intel's kind of seeding of the smartphone landscape earlier this year, finding stuff in the sub 2 watt product line in there from, Rockchip, who they already have a relationship with, MediaTek, those types of guys, I think makes a lot of sense. And it really does make sense for all parties. And as a consumer, it should be an exciting revelation that Intel has always had the best process, but has always been only Intel that gets to take advantage of it. And so the idea that we could see other vendors and other, markets see the advantages of Intel's R&D into process tech is actually really, really cool. It has the potential to make, accelerate power efficiency, accelerate performance increases in smartphone and maybe tablet spaces as well. But it's not going to be I would not expect it to be rather a blanket open invitation to anybody that happens to have an ARM license to come make your parts at Intel. I imagine you have to be a very large client with a very large run, and Intel's going to be very careful about who they're actually interacting with in this type of environment. But I guess I would agree with Josh's sentiment that you said, like, expected or surprising, not surprising, but expected, or whatever the other inverse, I guess. It's just, it's been a little bit here and there that we've seen them kind of work, to build FPGAs for other people as well. But to very quickly shift from here's our upcoming chipsets for the next generation smartphones to actually, just kidding, here we're going to help make other people's chips for upcoming smartphones is a fairly dramatic turnaround in a fairly short amount of time.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The other kind of big news that I feel like, certainly you covered it on PC Per, and it got covered in some of the corners of the big tech websites. But NVIDIA announced their Pascal Mobile GTX 1080, 1070, 1060 for gaming laptops. No, there's no M.
Right.
The presentation you're looking at right now, the slides up on PC Per, gaming laptops, plus 30% sales growth, a 20 million install base, which compares pretty favorably to the Xbox One with a 29 million user install base, and the PlayStation 4 with a maybe not as favorable as the PlayStation 4 with a 52 million user install base. But AMD and NVIDIA both predicting massive growth in mobile laptops, in part because mobile laptops are not the atrocious, overpriced 74-pound behemoths that they were for, what seems like decades. But this is literally You know, GP104, like you're looking at, I'm looking at the 1080 GTX 1080 specs. You know, GP104, 2,560 CUDA cores. It's running at a slightly reduced clock speed of base clock of 1,556 hertz, down from 1,607 on the desktop parts. 160 texture units, 8 gigs of memory. You know, memory's clocking at the same speed, a 256-bit memory interface. You know, memory bandwidth of 320 gigabytes per second, a TDP of around 150 watts, which is 30 watts lower than the desktop part. So obviously this is going to require a healthy laptop with a healthy cooling system and a massive power supply. You know, but you know, this is kind of ridiculous. So, you know, the peak compute's down like, you know, 0.3 of a teraflop, if you can even do the math on that. It's 7.9 teraflops, down from 8.2. The GTX 1070 mobile is actually exceeding the 1070 desktop part by like 0.2 of a teraflop. You know, running it again you know, 64 hertz lower than the desktop parts, but actually packs more CUDA cores or GPU cores than the GTX 1070 desktop part. And the GTX 1060, you know, is running, again, almost exactly the same specs. 6 gigabytes of memory, 1,404 base clock. You know, this is crazy, you know, crazy / awesome. These should, you know, it seems like they should spank the GTX 980 mobile. Am I overemphasizing that?
No. So the GT, so the way that they have kind of aligned the replacements is the GTX 1080 replaces the GTX 980 in the mobile space, not the 980M. Remember, they had the 980M and then they released the 980 later. And then the GTX 1070 replaces the GTX 980M. And then the GTX 1060 replaces the GTX 970M. And that is in terms of thermal envelopes, right? Like, so the idea is chassis vendors, you know, Asus, MSI, whoever else that builds a system that can handle a GTX 980 will be able to handle a GTX 1080. And you get a significant performance boost when you do that. And if you look, like the GTX 980 mobile was rated at 4.6 teraflops, whereas the GTX 1080 is rated at 8.2. So, you know, 70% more theoretical compute capability increase on that, you know, which won't directly translate into pure frame rate increases at that amount. But it's still really, really impressive. You know, the spec-wise, the 1070 mobile is the more interesting one because it actually runs at a higher core count. And the reason they did that is because they needed to hit a thermal envelope. They needed to hit that, you know, 115 watt, 120 watt envelope for that part. And apparently they found it was more efficient to have slightly more CUDA cores running at a slightly lower frequency at a slightly lower voltage, which is something you can, you know, they have the flexibility to do. It does make it a little bit confusing because now you have something labeled GTX 1070 that has 1920 CUDA cores, and one that has 2048, which is similar to now what we have at the 1063 gigabyte part we'll talk about in a second. But you know, the performance wise, it's not as exact as you might hope in terms of like desktop to mobile performance. Now, it's difficult because the platforms are fundamentally different, right? You know, we're running our GPU test bed on an 8-core system. You know, these mobile systems are quad-core systems, but you also have to keep in mind that there are thermal restrictions. So the average clock speeds will tend to be a little bit lower than what you get on the desktop side, but that being said, if you look at our graphs of GTX 1070 mobile versus desktop game results, there's one graph down at the bottom that has like green and blue lines on it. You'll see, yeah, you got 3D marks there. You can see like it's really close. It's not exactly on par, but it's really, really, really close. And it's much closer than the GTX 970 to the GTX 970M, or even the 980 to the 980M, right? So that's why they wanted to get rid of that M moniker at the end of the names, is because they thought that their performance thresholds were very, very close to desktop Founders Edition parts, and so they thought it was worth maybe a little bit of the brand confusion to prevent people from assuming that because it's a 980 or a 1080M or a 1070M that it's somehow lesser performance by significant margins. There's only 2 exceptions to that, and you can see that on that graph: GTA 5 and Hitman. And those are games where we saw CPU boundedness kind of creep in. So the quad core versus 8-core system is likely the culprit for those dramatic differences. So we're gonna, when we get in our full system reviews, we're gonna rebuild a more comparable desktop platform to test against those mobile systems. But if you're looking for a gaming laptop, basically all gaming laptops are now getting refreshed with this new chipset series. So you'll be able to have your choosing of a bunch of different parts from Asus or MSI and Gigabyte and EVGA's updating their SC17 line. And, you know, they're not cheap. I think the least expensive GTX 1060 based notebook I've seen thus far is what, $1599, maybe $1499. So you're not quite getting into the budget gaming realm yet. But I imagine we'll see like a GTX 1050 relatively soon as well, if that's something you're concerned with financially. So, but still a pretty cool, a pretty interesting release. Yeah, there are other things too, like they added 2560 by 1440 120 hertz displays to notebooks, and that sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. The MSI has announced that they've updated their gaming laptops with NVIDIA Pascal graphics. Pretty much their entire lineup, you know, the Titan SLI, the Titan 4K, the GT73 VR Titan SLI, which are running Core i7 6920 HQ or HK processors, you know, 18.4-inch 1080p or 3840, like 4K monitors. You know, the 1070s across the board on the less expensive laptops. I mean, these are, you know, you're talking about for the Titan SLI is kind of crazy. You know, you're talking about dual GTX 1080s and a $5,100 price tag. The Titan 4K and the Titan SLI are running at $4,000 and $3,600. The more affordable Core i7 6700 HQ powered models are down at a much more reasonable 15 or 17-inch 1080p monitor, selling for $2,100 to $2,700. And Gigabyte's announced refreshes for their 15 and 15.6 and 17.3-inch laptops. 1070s in their thin and light Ultraforce devices, and 1060s and 1070s in their performance gaming boxes. So this is something that's rolling out fast. I'd be really curious to see what the battery life is like on those. You know, if you're curious about memory overclocking, this is not something we've gotten into a whole lot on the show lately, because the performance, usually the return on investment for expensive memory usually hasn't been particularly huge. But Corsair was at IDF, and Overclockers Club just did a roundup of their new 64 gigabyte Dominator Platinum series, which is DDR4 running at 3200 megahertz. That is perhaps not quite as awesomely attractive as Corsair's LED-equipped memory, but you know, if it's when you look at the available offerings in the 4x16 gigabyte, 3200 megahertz, 64 gigabyte capacity module size at your favorite e-tailers, right? Overclockers Club, the Dominator modules are going to come at a premium price by comparison, but you are getting a premium product. So binning process, hand-selected memory ICs, custom designed cooling optimized PCBs. You know, you're probably not going to pull that much more unless you're spending a lot of time finding a particularly overclockable CPU. You're probably not necessarily going to get a huge, unless your current DDR4 memory modules are particularly atrocious. You know, you're probably not going to get a huge performance hit, but they should make it as easy as possible if you want to try to run your memory at 3200 megahertz. So, you know, and then Overclockers testing, quote, I found that the higher speed bin was a bit more advantageous than the increased capacity when running the numbers. The higher speed bin with looser timings on the modules did not always outperform the lower speed bin parts, but it was able to run with tighter timings at 15, 17, 17, 36 using the XPM P2 applied sub-timings to close that gap. So you get what you pay for, and they are not the cheapest high-speed memory modules out there. Did you hear anybody talking about DDR4 prices going up at IDF?
I did not. Is that something that's being discussed? I don't want to hear that.
It was a memory manufacturer I was talking to, and they said, so obviously there's a particular bias there. You know, I was talking to somebody who's, you know, so they obviously would like you to buy all the memory and buy it now. But that said, they said that they're having difficulty sourcing DDR4 because they are now competing with masses of Chinese cell phone manufacturers that are differentiating their Android products by hurling as much memory at the processor and onboard storage as they can. And that they are competing with organizations pulling huge volumes for memory. I thought that was interesting because basically they were saying we don't expect DDR4 prices to go down, and we wouldn't be surprised if they go up between now and the end of the year. You know, that kind of makes me, you know, think about the Huawei Honor 8, which was also announced this week, which is kind of like their new, their US friendly version of the P9. Have you had a chance to go hands-on with the Honor 8 yet?
I have it. I have it here, and I've just barely kind of started using it. Again, I took a red-eye in last night and just kind of was waking up this morning. It is beautiful. It is a gorgeous design. It's glass front, glass back, but it has like a slightly brushed metal finish underneath the glass. It's, you know, it's iPhone stylish in terms of like, you know, the edges of it and the roundedness on the corners. It's a little bit bigger than it fits in size between the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6. I'm sorry, between the 6S and the 6S Plus. It has dual cameras on the back. It's got a fingerprint sensor on the back that's actually very fast. The camera is, I think it's 2 Sony Zeiss lenses on the back of it. So far, just in taste. Go ahead.
Are they Zeiss lenses? I know the P9 was a partnership with Leica for that dual.
Was it? Okay.
Dual,
I'll have to look up the spec sheet on it. I thought they said it was Sony on this one.
Okay, that wouldn't entirely surprise. There's not a huge amount of information out on it right now.
Yeah. It went on pre-sale yesterday, I think. And you know, the brand Honor is kind of like a subsidiary of Huawei, but their task was like online sales only, not through carriers, unlocked phones all the time that are available to work on all networks, and it's an interesting, you know, goal. Like OnePlus is essentially doing the same type of thing, but Honor has the push of the enormous entity that is Huawei behind it as well.
Right.
This is a $399 phone, and it's this is a 4 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of storage iteration. It does have an SD card slot, so you can put up to 128 gigs more into it. The price is a little bit concerning to me because you have other options, other really good options in that same segment, like the OnePlus 3. What's the other one that's now I'm blanking on there's another like unlocked phone that's $399. It just came out. I don't know where I'm going with it, but there are other competing options that have like higher res screens. This is a 1080p screen that have, you know, comparable cameras that have, you know, the same type of feature sets as well. Yeah, I can't think of the name of the one that is that I'm missing now, but it has like it has front-facing speakers, which is a feature I actually really appreciate. So I'm interested in this. Yeah,
it was one of the reviews I read. It's funny. So the Huawei P9 was co-engineered with Leica with the dual camera design. There's no Leica markings on the Honor 8. You know, the ZTE. It's interesting because Honor was using Snapdragon processors, and they went for a oh goodness, I can never remember that name. The CPU on the Honor. Kirin, yeah, which should be comparable to an 820. But it's also amazing when you start looking around, like, you know, the ZTE's Axon 7 is on pre-order for $400, you know, and the OnePlus 3, of course, is selling right now for $399. And so there seems to be a growing market for, you know, $400 flagship killer phones.
Right.
So I'm curious, you know, I'm curious to see how it does. I'm curious to hear what your opinions of it are. It is a good-looking phone and a good-looking screen.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a super high res, but the quality is there. Again, I get that phone that I can't remember what the hell it is. It also has an AMOLED screen, so it's AMOLED, front-facing speakers, and it was also $399. Okay, I'm gonna have to find this for the end of the show so I don't go crazy.
Axon 7 sounds a lot like the Axon 7.
Yeah, maybe it is.
It's an OLED screen.
Yeah, I think that might be it. So I don't see that in the spec, but yeah.
So many cameras, so many phones.
There are a lot of phones. Yes, there are a lot of phones. But I have been away from Android for a long time, so I'm gonna plug in my extra T-Mobile SIM card here and mess around with this and see, you know, what the battery life is like. It's got a 3,000 milliamp hour battery in here. Specification-wise, the Huawei Mate 8 is very similar to the guts of this. Right, the screen size is different and the screen resolution is different, but the computing capability, I think the camera setup is pretty much the same. So I'll be curious to see what that comparison is like, because I think the Mate 8 has a 3,900 milliamp hour battery, something a little bit bigger than that. So,
what's the storage on that? 32 gigabytes?
They have a 32 gig and a 64 gig model, and the 64 gig model is $449. So it's $50 more, but everything else stays the same in terms of system memory and everything. So,
is there an SD card slot?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Good.
Micro SD up to 128 gigs. So yeah, it's got all the features you want. It's just there are a lot of phones that have all the features you want these days. So
how terrible is that?
It's not bad for consumers. It's bad for when you try to make when you're a company trying to make a product to distinguish itself. This one has a lot of style and design to it as well. So, and actually they gave us a case with it that's like basically a perfectly clear. They match it to the color of the phone. So this is the case to go on the back of the phone. And the idea is obviously to protect a little bit without hiding some of the color and of the phone. But I've always been one of those people that gets annoyed when you get a really nice looking phone like an iPhone 6S and then you put a leather wrap case in it so you can't tell what it looks like and all you can see is a screen anyway. But you'd be crazy to not put them in a case when they cost as much as they do and they break as easily as they do. So
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you of all people. Yeah, it is the ZTE Axon 7. It's a 1440p AMOLED. It's Scott Michaud is buying one apparently. So yes,
it's a good time to be buying a $400 phone. And it's kind of crazy, right? The Moto G Plus, the Moto G, like 32 gigabytes of RAM is $229. The 64 gigabyte version of the Moto G Plus with a 16 megapixel dual flash camera with laser focus and a fingerprint reader is like $299. It is a good time to be buying Android phones if you can just get OS updates. Not that I'm cranky about that.
Yeah.
Cranky. You know what I'm not cranky about? This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Automatic, the small adapter that turns your clunker into a smarter, connected car. Automatic has just launched the Automatic Pro, their new unlimited 3G car adapter with no monthly fees or subscription. Always there. The 3G lets you know where your vehicle is parked at any time and lets you track your vehicle in case of theft. It works with If This, Then That for endless customization, connecting your car to the rest of your life. And you can easily file business expenses with popular apps like Concur and Expensify. You can even link your car to a Nest thermostat or Amazon Echo. Imagine it. Alexa, where did I park my car? Yes, you can do that. If you're the person that keeps losing the car, Automatic is here to help. You can even get human help in a crash. Automatic Pro detects severe accidents, and trained responders call for help when you can't. And it works on nearly every car made after 1996. It takes just minutes to connect your car to your iPhone or Android device via Bluetooth. It even integrates with Apple Watch and Pebble if you want to feel totally connected to your automotive experience. Oh, my goodness. Hue, Nest, Amazon Echo, If This, Then That. It is a really amazing opportunity to integrate your car into your home automation. Automatic Pro is normally $129.95, but when you use our exclusive offer code TWIT, that's TWIT, you'll save $20. Do yourself a favor, visit automatic.com/twit for more information. And remember to use that offer code TWIT, that's TWIT, to save $20 off the regular purchase price. That's automatic.com/twit. and we want to thank them for their support.
Cool.
So many fun things to plug into the OBD2 port now. It makes me so happy. Oh, my goodness. We mentioned Intel Developer Forum 2016. We were both there for the keynotes. Huawei did their events late that evening, which is where you started getting hands-on with the Huawei. Not a lot of conversation about processors. A lot of conversation about Project Alloy. Not something I particularly expected to see coming from Intel. Their prototype of a completely self-contained VR rig. You know, the computational power, the graphics, the comms, the battery. It is completely cable-free. And what was interesting, they're integrating RealSense into it, right? No external sensors. And the ability to sort of roam from room to room. And the thing that was really amazing to me was watching them interact with Craig Raymond was up on stage. And you can see him there. And there's a point in the video, if you get a chance to look at it, where he is holding up his fingers and Intel Alloy is overlaying, you know, he's moving his fingers and his fingers are interacting with objects in VR. And then he pulls $1 out of his pocket and uses that to sculpt something inside the VR world. Which is pretty slick as far as VR demos go. That level of interactivity, that, you know, being able to use your hands, the idea of it being completely self-contained and untethered. I was talking to Norm over at Tested because he's spent so much time with the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift, and he's gotten the chance to play around with the PlayStation VR. You know, he feels most people have a pretty good cable sense pretty quickly once they start using a VR rig, but I like the idea of being able to completely roam and move around with that. Intel's not going to be building this themselves, which is, I think, is kind of unfortunate, but they're opening up the hardware design and the APIs for the, quote, ecosystem, unquote, and they're going to let developers and partners create their own branded products in 2017, and I'm pretty well assuming that's the second half. So what you're looking at right now is their sort of discussion of the room-to-room demo, the idea that you'll be able to sort of detect walls and not walk into them, or into, you know, Fortune 500 CEOs was one of the jokes on stage. But there's the har. But if you see the golden lathe comes up, and that's when he pulls the $1 out of his pocket and starts interacting with devices in there. And of course, the video is not showing any of the hands because demo videos from presentations are always so cruel.
Actually, so there you see the other person, right? That's your do not run into a CEO prevention, and then he'll hold his hands up here,
Mr. Kazanich,
in front of his in front of his screen here for a little bit. So I have a couple of thoughts on this. One, that is a huge device, and from somebody who's put it on, it's very heavy, right? Because it is self-contained. It's got to have a battery. The idea of the RealSense camera being there and that allows you to use your hands as controllers, right? It's doing, you know, Connect level or beyond Connect level tracking of individual fingers and stuff is actually really, really powerful. Right. And I would love to see this implemented on all VR headsets so that developers can really start to take advantage of it. The problem is the current RealSense technology, in my experience, is fairly latent and fairly low refresh. And that doesn't pair well with VR, right? No. Anything that is running at 30 hertz.
In VR.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, you don't know exactly, you're not the guy, you know, looking through the screen, so you don't really know how it's, you know, what the difference is versus what he's doing and what he's actually seeing. My assumption would be that it's not quite in real time, that there's a little bit of latency behind it, that there's a little bit of lag, and that's obviously needs to be fixed. So they need to get a higher refresh on the camera. They need to get higher refresh on the on just RealSense in general, and then, you know, they talked about the benefits of an untethered device are astounding. However, there's a reason why we use high-end PCs with significant graphics horsepower for VR interactions today. Like it's not, we haven't solved VR to the point, you know, and rendering and all that stuff to a point where Intel integrated graphics is where is where anybody thinks we should be with that stuff.
Sure.
So You know, this
Well, that
is
was one of
using
the
integrated graphics, and that's to me, this is more proof of concept for, hey, in 5 years we'll be able to do this, not proof of concept in 2017 we'll be able to
right.
do this.
One of the interesting demos, and one of the only places where they really got into the idea of, hey, remember Intel? We make processors. Was the demo they did during the show of a Dell XPS with a Core i5 Kaby Lake processor running Blizzard's Overwatch. You know, which was very, very brief. They spent like 8 times as much time talking about how the Kaby Lake processors are totally ready for 4K. They have H.265 decoding built in. We are ready for all the 4K things. And then they're like, oh, and hey, you know, play this game. It's Blizzard's Overwatch. It's running on a laptop using the integrated Intel Core i5 graphics from Kaby Lake, which I thought was pretty awesome. But you know, one of the things we talked about, it's like, okay, what resolution are they playing at? What refresh rate? What are the settings on that? You know, Blizzard's Overwatch is not the most taxing 3D game, but I thought it was nice that they actually had an actual relatively recent 3D game playing at something other than like 640 by 480
Right.
on a laptop screen. I mean, you know, if reference to the idea that I don't know if the graphics or the integrated graphics are ready for VR, and they certainly are not with the current integrated graphics on Intel processors. But that gave the idea that they seem to be making big jumps in terms of graphics, integrated graphics, 3D graphics performance on laptops. Right. So
yeah,
we'll find out.
Yep,
we'll find out in 2017, maybe. Intel RealSense for drones, the Typhoon. The unique Typhoon that we saw earlier this year went on sale at IDF 2016 for a hefty $1,800. And I don't know if you can pull up the graphic from the Intel Aerial Technology page, but if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see the Intel Aero compute board, which is not inexpensive at $399, although for commercial UAVs, it's not a particularly large price. But Intel Atom processor, Linux OS, a ton of dedicated APIs and applications for drone flight, and LTE communications built in, which gives you the idea that you'll be able to communicate with this UAV or drone from very long distances. And then the compute board, they're going to have, I guess, next year, they're going to take that board with drone code PX4 and AirMap SDKs, and they will basically offer a development platform, a complete ready-to-fly drone, which is what you were just looking at there a second ago. Edson, which is RealSense for robots. And the thing that I didn't really expect and was really thrilled to see until I saw the pricing on it was Intel's Joule. And this is an interesting product. They talked about the 550 selling for, I want to say $370, maybe $399. $370 for the 550X. And what you're looking there is essentially a great big development platform, and the idea that you'll be able to develop your new Internet of Things product and then automatically dump a Joule module into it and ship without having to go from like, you know, we built this thing. So if you're looking at small computers and thinking about, you know, Odroids at $70 or you know, chip PCs for $9 or Raspberry Pis for $25 or $30. This is obviously a lot more expensive, but it's always, right. You know, it is considerably more powerful. When you take a look at the fact sheet on that, you're looking at, you know, an Atom processor, and, you know, you're looking at a 64-bit 1.7 gigahertz quad-core Intel Atom processor, 4 gigabytes of RAM, 16 gigabytes of eMMC memory, HD graphics, 4K video capture and display ready, 802.11a AC Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.1. There it is. It's a really small unit when you get it out of that development board. And the development board's designed to facilitate connections to RealSense and other stuff. USB 3.0, multiple GPIO ports, UART I2C interfaces. Again, it's running a Linux operating system. You know, they went out of their way to make it compatible with RealSense cameras and libraries. The $369 one, I guess, is a 1.5 gigahertz quad-core Intel Atom and with 8 gigabytes of eMMC. But they call it like the inventor product lineup. So Intel was pretty big on that, and of course, doing their you know, America's most awesomest adventures programming. And the Grush team came on and said, Grush will be shipping the toothbrush that turns toothbrushing into a game. Will be shipping later this year, and they were very excited about that.
They were very, excited.
Toothbrush. Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? They're going to be billionaires, and they made something from an idea, and they're going to be shipping a product, which is always exciting.
That's true.
I'm not feeling it, man. Can we get a little love? Just a little bit?
Not yet. I gotta experience the toothbrush gaming for myself before I get excited about it.
Television bathroom televisions, they're back, man. GTX 1063 gigabyte edition, which is interesting, not just because, wow, there's another 1060 being announced that we probably can't buy, but it has fewer CUDA cores than the 6 gigabyte edition. What's going on with that?
I don't know. So this was a rumor from last week that I thought would in no way be true. Like we just talked about the GTX 1070 on the mobile part having 128 more CUDA cores than the GTX 1070 desktop. And I justified this change as well. They were trying to get the equal performance levels in order to, but they were restrained on thermal and voltage input on the mobile part. So I gave him a pass, modestly. This one is way, it's just so stupid, right? So they just have a 1060 that has half as much memory, has 3 gigs instead of 6 gigs, but also 128 fewer CUDA cores, which, you know, it's still based on GP106. It is, you know, it's going to perform very close, right? You know, we're talking about a 10% drop in CUDA cores, but the memory speed stays the same, and your memory throughput stays the same, and your clock speed stay the same. So I would guess you're probably talking about 5 to 7% performance delta between the 1066 gig and the 1063 gig. But I mean, these are different parts, right? Like that would be calling I don't know, like the 1080 and then the 1070, which is really just fewer shader processors than the 1080. You know, saying, oh, calling it the 1084 gig, but it has 256 fewer CUDA cores or whatever it is, right? It just it's odd to me that they would do this. Clearly, they have the reason is likely that they have a whole bunch of parts that are yielding out at 1152 usable CUDA cores at those speeds, but not 1280 usable CUDA cores at those speeds. This also allows them to get their price point down a little bit lower, $199. So this is the, you know, price competitive direct competitor to the RX 480, you know, 4 gig card, which is, you know, still kind of MIA as well. So you are getting $50 less off the price tag for a 10% drop in potential 10% drop in performance, probably closer to 5. So if you think about it, you're getting 20% off the price for 7% off the performance. Okay, you start to see the benefit to the mainstream consumer that thought $249, $260, whatever it was for the 6 gig version is a little bit too pricey. If you can get something in the $199 range, that's more in your wheelhouse. So, you know, that's good. It's an unfortunate naming conundrum that I don't know why they do these things. I don't know why they do these things.
I think they do it just to irritate you, but
well, success, I guess. Success there. I did want to mention, since you brought up stock, there are a ton of GTX 1070s in stock.
yeah,
There are 0 RX 480s in stock, as far as I can tell. There are, let's see, we look at the 1080s, and where's that blasted 1060 at? Now in stock.net. Now in stock.net. Classic
which is not
place.
paid for. It's just such a useful tool.
It is incredibly useful. Yeah.
Because I'm actually
there's plenty of 1080s available as well.
I'm looking at even on Amazon now, you're looking at like EVGA's GeForce GTX 1070 selling for $429. You can pre-order Gigabyte's GTX 1070 for $429. That's going to be available on the 25th of August. Other brands are selling, Zotac, GTX 1070 AMP is selling for $439. So they're actually finally selling for the prices they were supposed to be, although you can still pay, you know, $500 plus if you shop poorly. 1080 GTX 1080s are selling for $729 from MSI, $609 from Zotac, or $647.49 used, which kind of makes me laugh.
Right.
Now GTX 1060s, You know, 327, 328, 347.
Yeah, it's still a little bit high.
Yeah, well, you know what? Zotac's got a okay, it's pre-ordering. It's not going to be available until 21st, but a GeForce GTX 1060 mini 6GB GDDR5 super compact graphics card. He stares at his tiny PC case for $249. So that's getting into the right neighborhood.
Nice. Yeah.
Is it worth upgrading from a 950 to a 1060? I mean, it should be like double.
That's going to be a pretty significant performance delta, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really wish I hadn't bought that GTX 950 a few weeks ago. But, you know, at least it was cheap. Hey, man, I know what happens. I buy something and something more awesome gets introduced. It's a tradition at TWiCH.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the GTX 950s are selling for 120 to 140 bucks. Man. So it's double the performance for $100 more. And avoid the 3GB version.
Yep.
Yeah. Man, wonder when RX 480s are going to be back in stock.
I don't know. I don't know. I ask like every day. Actually, you know what? I traveled so much that I used to every day I would pester somebody at AMD. It's like, why aren't there any more RX 480s in stock? And then I went on like 3 consecutive trips. I didn't pester them for 3 weeks, and now I'm back and there's still no RX 480s in stock. So I actually need to do more research into that because that's been a long time. So we'll see.
Oh, wait. Oh, no, you don't want that. I thought I found a 480. Okay, here we go. $339 for an RX 480.
That's $90 over.
Yeah.
Is it an 8 gig card, I assume?
Yes.
Yeah, that's still $80 over what it's supposed to be.
$349 for one. Yeah, those are still a little pricey. There you have it.
Yep.
The GPU update,
confusing.
ladies and gentlemen.
Your weekly GPU stock update. There you go.
We're a little
Sorry, we don't
obsessed.
have better news.
Oh my goodness. Now I'm like, oh man, GTX 1060. Actually, the power consumption on the 480 is a little higher than I'm ready for in my.
It's 150 watts, but probably a little bit over that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Not quite ready for that. 120 watts. 120 watts on the 1060. 1060 is still looking like the next jump in GPU performance for me. One last story before we go. Gigabyte BRIX Gaming UHD 2.6L chassis, a 2.6 liter chassis with discrete GPU. If you've been thinking to yourself, man, those Mac Pros are awesome, but I want to run Windows. This is the computer for you.
It's really cool looking. It's really
stylish.
cool looking. Like when I walked up to their booth at IDF, it like stood out immediately, right? Like, oh, this looks like one of those new high-end routers. And then I picked it up and looked at all the ports on the back. It's like, nope, not a router. Definitely a computer. There's a lot of stuff plugged in there, right? So this has a GTX 950 in it. Though what I'm being told is it's going to be replaced by a Pascal part soon. Now, I think they haven't said this, but I assume it's going to be a GTX 1050 and not a GTX 1060 that comes in there. But it's kind of like the Mac Pro idea of getting everything into this very small space, having to redesign your PCB and your systems to get it there. It's pretty pricey. $1,300, I think, is what they said. So, to me, it's a very cool looking design. It's interesting to see the inside of it. It has like support for quad display output. It's got gigabit. It's got 802.11ac. It's got USB 3.1. It's got 4 USB 3.0 ports. It's basically a full-fledged PC. You'd be able to use this as your everyday computer for sure. I was told it was maybe a little bit hot. It was running a little bit hot with a single fan trying to draw air through the entirety of the chassis. And the price seems a little bit high for what you get as well. So hopefully when this actually goes on sale, it will A, have a different GPU in it, and B, be a little bit less expensive. But they basically took like an Intel NUC or a Gigabyte BRIX system and just like stretched it vertically so they could cram, discrete GPU in there, and then have a place for airflow to go through the entirety of the tower. So it's neat looking. It's worth checking out, but I probably won't be recommending anybody buy it if it stays $1,300.
Well, you know, what price style, sir?
I have a very specific price, and it's not that much.
Not that much.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, man. Yeah, we talked about IDF on Tech Thing this week. Alan made some time for us, and we got we seriously nerded out on storage, SSDs, and what's going on in that area. And man, sub $100 headphone DACs, which there are some amazing deals out there. And oh my goodness, let's talk about the hell that is Linux Wi-Fi drivers when things go wrong. When Huawei Honor 8 reviews coming up, what else is coming up on PC Per this week?
We're gonna look at the Honor 8. I have a ton of stuff. We've got some new Logitech parts in, some new mouse, keyboard, headset options coming up. Scott did a really good animation of describing DirectX 12 Vulkan multi-GPU configurations, where we combined. He did a really good 3D animation to kind of demonstrate the problems and pitfalls and how all that works. I did some voiceover for it, and we're going to release that next week. It'll be interesting, hopefully explain some of the complexity of DirectX 12 and Vulkan multi-GPU. And then, I don't know, as I look across the room, oh, I got that OLED Lenovo X1 Yoga in as well. Nice. The OLED screen. So curious about that. Curious about that.
You got the little one in?
It's the X1 Yoga. It's the ThinkPad X1 Yoga.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking of something else.
Yeah, it's a 14-inch laptop. We've already looked at the laptop with a standard screen. This is the OLED. My first impression is I need to email them and ask, because it doesn't look like it gets as bright as I remembered it being at CES. The clarity is still there. The color quality is still there. The blacks are still, you know, impressively dark blacks. But like turning up the brightness all the way doesn't seem to get it as bright as I remember seeing. So I wonder if there's some issue with power consumption in like all white screens when you have an AMOLED on there. So we'll see.
Oh, you could have a long and profoundly intense conversation with Robert Heron about the nature of white and monitors.
I may need to do that.
It's fascinating and slightly terrifying. Oh my goodness. With that, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this week in computer hardware. If you haven't heard the show before, welcome. And you should please check out twit.tv/TWiCH, and you'll find links to all of our older shows and how to subscribe on your favorite podcatcher to watch the video or listen to the audio. You can find Ryan Shrout at PCPer.com. You can find me at TechThing or TechThing.com or AVXL.com. And we want to thank you for listening and invite you to come back and join us next week. With that, I'm Patrick Norton.
I'm Ryan Shrout.
We'll see you next week on Twitch.